Hi everyone, David here. This is the topic analysis for critical affirmatives for the 2019 September-October topic. When thinking about creating critical affirmatives, one of the things we want to do is reinterpret certain key phrases in the resolution in order to make them more suitable for our app. The easiest terms to reinterpret that have an impact on how you would approach the case are the subject and the object of the resolution. Take the current resolution, for example. In the United States, colleges and universities ought not consider standardized tests in undergraduate admissions decisions. The subject of the resolution is colleges and universities, and the object of the resolution is standardized tests. Colleges and universities refers to the institutions responsible for higher level education in the United States. However, they can also be larger symbols of liberal education. Liberal education is just a buzzword implying the way people typically generate knowledge and the structure of knowledge. It's a project emphasizing the necessity for education and attempting to maximize the scope of educational projects. The university is the institution that controls and manages this knowledge. The most effective critical affirmatives will interpret the university as an antagonistic institution that should be rejected based on the violence that they produce with their power over knowledge. Standardized tests would represent two things. The first being some type of oppressive metric by which bodies get compared to one another. The second being societal pressure, which this comparison often produces. So let's see how this layout interacts with some critical positions and storyboard some critical acts. The first act we're going to talk about is the anti-blackness affirmative from the topical perspective. A topical anti-blackness affirmative would say that the existing achievement gap in standardized testing blatantly ignores structural advantages that white students have that black students do not as a result of systemic injustices. Therefore, considering the standardized test with full knowledge of these disadvantages is anti-black. It also then means that black students are constantly forced to try to measure up to white students and a standard of education that was inaccessible to them from the start. This also has material implications. Because standardized tests have such a large impact on what opportunities will become accessible to black students, rigging the game against them becomes a tactic to solidify white over black domination, not just in terms of education, but also in terms of wealth. It should come as no secret that families with higher education levels tend to generate more wealth at every stage of their lives, which means that setting up a system that black students cannot access means that white people will always have economic leverage over them. The last argument supporting the elimination of standardized tests based on anti-blackness is that these tests are just a way for the nation to reinforce the biases they already have about black people. The dominant narrative in relationship to black students is that they're intellectually inferior to white students, right? Because the SAT advertised itself as a test where two groups of students will take the same test but ignore the systemic reasons for an achievement gap, they allow white racists to shield their biases under the guise of material proof, which would be the results of these standardized tests. The picture on the right is a perfect example of this. This is a picture of Florida student Camilla Campbell. She took the SAT the first time and got a 1900 on it. She then got a tutor and then studied for the test again and increased her score by 300 points. But the College Board then elected to invalidate her score because they thought it was illegitimate. So instead of presuming that this black girl had worked hard to pass the test, they couldn't fathom how a black person could make such a radical improvement. In their mind, either the test was invalid or the process by which she got the score was invalid, which is just a fancy way of saying she cheated. This impulse represents the larger problem with the structure of standardized tests as it relates to anti-blackness. Even when black students manage to pass the test, they will always be seen as invalid because they are black, which means that pass or fail, it's always fail for black students. The only way to resolve this would be to eliminate the standardized test so that speculation could never start. Now that's the topical way to think about anti-blackness. So from the non-topical perspective, the affirmative would say that these forms of anti-blackness are inherent to the institutions and therefore inevitable in those institutions. They would be larger criticisms of those institutions and the way that anti-blackness acts within them. One such affirmative could say, interrogate the history of standardized tests as they've related to black people. So go back to literacy tests. The standardized tests that were instituted during the Jim Crow era follow the exact same model as standardized tests today and serve a similar purpose: to stop black people from being able to generate power through a process that should be a right. That act would say the similarities in the tactics are not coincidences, but are rather investments in the anti-black mindset by the institutions in power. One of the cornerstone ideas shared by many critical race theorists is that anti-blackness is not produced by individual processes, but is rather produced by larger investments in a project of anti-blackness. Therefore, the only ethical action is to critique both these institutions and that larger project. Speaking of the structure of colleges and universities being racist, let's think real long and hard about what the process of college admissions is similar to. The point of college admissions process is to select the strongest and most productive applicant for the benefit of the university. Money is money, which means that when the university chooses to take one person's money instead of some other applicants, they're investing in that person's productive capacity. So when black students apply, colleges are literally picking the best black people who can be the most productive to their institution. As we scan through American history, there's one obvious phenomenon that's similar. Take a second. Got it? Slavery. Now, the thesis of this argument is not that college is like slavery, or that, like, when black students apply for college, they're making the choice to be slaves, Kanye. However, it's another layer of proof that the basic means of operation for these institutions is dependent on an anti-black model, which means that we should definitely reject those institutions. But the question is why? The first justification might be a reason to reject standardized tests, and the second one could even be a reason to reject the traditional college admissions process. But, like, why reject the institution? Well, more radical thinkers would say that the larger problem is that the drive to consistently reform and accommodate black people is based on an anti-black desire to include them. While these thinkers would never say that anti-blackness has, like, increased or decreased, they can often acknowledge that the way anti-blackness happens has changed dramatically. These institutions don't want to push black kids away anymore, because pushing them away does not serve their goal. Instead, they want to include black kids because it helps their reputation. This is the distinction between negrophobia and negrophilia. We now have a negrophilic relationship to blackness. Everyone wants to show off their black friends, and these institutions are no different. However, in the same way that plantations instrumentalized slaves to pick cotton, which was bad, bringing black kids to be instrumentalized because they are black is anti-black and should be rejected, which means that all of those individual acts of reform only legitimize anti-blackness as a fixable problem instead of demonizing it and anti-black institutions. Next affirmative is the model minority Aff, which is very much born out of the opposite. This affirmative comes not from a lack of performance by Asian students, but from overperforming by Asian students. Because Asian students tend to do extremely well academically, they're constantly the standard of perfection, where anything else is considered failure. This, however, can be extremely negative for them. First, because anything less than perfect becomes failure, Asian students often overexhaust themselves trying to meet this unattainable standard, and whenever they don't, they get demonized for it. This also produces psychological violence, as Asian students will often insulate themselves and focus on nothing else but comparing themselves to unattainable standards. It becomes a form of self-management where the standard becomes something they apply to themselves as opposed to having it be applied to them by the rest of the world. The affirmative is structurally sound, but it lacks the ethos of other affirmatives that are fortified by a history and legacy of injustice. In other words, it's really hard to get people to feel bad when someone is overperforming. However, the more dangerous part of the myth of the model minority is that when Asians do meet the standards, their performance gets leveraged as a way to demonize other bodies. This is entirely consistent with the historical narrative of Asian integration into the American system. We used to have laws, not one, a series of laws excluding Asians from even entering the United States. But when black and Latino people, or the darker races, started succeeding, America changed its tone. They began letting in huge numbers of Asians and highlighting their academic success. They gave special visas to Asians that could be productive in the United States, and then used their success to endorse a pull yourself up by your bootstraps narrative against black and Latino people. This relationship is not ideal for either black and Latino people or Asians. There's a real psychological impact to knowing that when you succeed, other people get hurt, and when you fail, you will get hurt, which means that Asian Americans become nothing more than weapons in the white man's war. This approach can be conducive to a wider range of methods. Some of the more popular ones involve performing resistance to the weaponization of the Asian body. So more rejection-based Affs or like narrative-based Affs like the Osajima conscientization method could be useful ways to engage this body of literature. The biopower affirmative. The biopower Aff is a simple case with strong theoretical underpinnings. Foucault has written a lot about how schools and education are modeled under prisons, as with most of our public services, because their goal is no longer to provide something to the public, but is rather to manage the public. What they do is they connect a bunch of vital processes and coalesce them in order to aggregate power to an institution, even if that power is divided among multiple different steps. This is a much more effective way to manage people's lives and control them. Let's take an example. Universities know that in the US job market, it is virtually impossible to succeed without a 4-year degree. They then make standardized tests the primary way to get into a 4-year college. If they reject your score, they've also rejected the ability for you to succeed in the US job market, which pretty much dooms you to a life of abject poverty. So even though a test proctor might have their own level of power to monitor the test, and a college board might have authority over administering the test and grading it, ultimately all of those subdivisions of power coalesce around the university and what their evaluation of your score is. This ultimate power is what Foucault calls sovereign power, the final decision between another body's life and death. Another way to think about how this produces biopolitical control is that it then converts all of these multi-layered students, each with their own story and need to apply to the university, into just a subset of data. These data-driven subjects are called algorithmic subjects. Their subjectivity becomes reduced to numbers that become easily surveyable. So the students that get a 1500 become more important and more valuable than the ones that got a 1300, and those numbers become markers for death. CAP. In order to make the CAP-Aff a viable option, it's important to interrogate both the function and the intention of the standardized tests. Those tests are about efficiency. You'll often have teachers spending more time on SAT tricks than actual educational content because learning those tricks is a more efficient approach. However, whenever this approach succeeds, it teaches students that efficiency and productiveness yield good results, which better helps them get integrated into the neoliberal mindset. The processes by which we learn are they're not separated from what we learn. These tests teach an efficiency-first model. Similar to biopower, what's at stake in terms of the future is used as a tool to reinforce capitalism. Students are trained to associate success with this test and engagement with the capitalist system as both being universal goods, while ignoring the massive structural violence effects of capitalism and the existential risk it proposes. So that's the intent. On a purely functional level, there are entire industries that are created based on this drive for students to pass the test. But profit off of fear is at the heart of capitalism. These industries are parasitic and represent the worst of the neoliberal state. They also routinely interfere with politics through lobbying, which is another link to CAP. This is one of the easier topical stories to tell with a potentially large impact. From a rejection first perspective, debaters can make claims about how the operation of these universities is contingent on capitalist mindsets and why a shift away from the capitalist imperative would bring those down. So, one of the interesting things that I found is that there's not a lot of statistics out there about a traditional achievement gap between queer and cis people. However, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that it's harder for queer people to fit within traditional education systems because they often ignore the more qualitative things that might hinder success in the educational model. For example, the immense societal pressure and familial pressure that comes from being queer often means that they don't have the same support structures. The act of ignoring this is called invisibilization, which happens often in the university. This can be a great thesis for an affirmative, but it also makes it hard to justify that getting rid of the test actually solves, which is why this Aff could elect to discuss pedagogical resistance. So instead about talking about individual colleges and universities, this affirmative would be a much larger criticism of heteronormativity and would describe the day-to-day life of queerness as a constant test, i.e. comparing themselves to the standards of heteronormativity. To get more detailed around core topic literature, it can be said for teaching a standardized model of education makes it impossible for individuals to embrace queer pedagogy, which is about a constant process of fluid experimentation. And embracing of queer pedagogy would oblige a rejection of standardization, which would be the way that you end up talking about the resolution. Disability. Standardized testing might be one of the most ableist concepts that's ever been created. First, visit the history of standardized testing. A lot of them were created as tools for mental institutions to arbitrarily label certain people as disabled, which then became their warrant to engage in vile procedures against those people. So right off the bat, its setup is rooted in ableism. But the real problem is that standardized tests can't differentiate between different types of learners, which means that disabled students will always start behind the 8 ball. Pro-standardized test advocates like to point to accommodations that are made for disabled people when they're taking these tests. First, there are a whole set of problems with the structure of the standardized test that none of these accommodations can resolve, because most of those test accommodations are just like giving students more time. Second, these accommodations end up being abused by people who are not disabled, who claim it in order to score better on the test. These are all reasons why those accommodations wouldn't work and why the test has got to go. But let's say for a second that the test is redeemable and the accommodations are effective. If that's true, then those accommodations just become a bright line that's drawn in order to create a narrative of like good versus bad disabled person. The good disabled person fights hard and uses the support of the institution, notice how the institution gets valorized here, in order to advance. The bad disabled person leeches off their disability as an excuse not to work hard and use it as a crutch. But this differentiation is in and of itself ableist because it doesn't take into account whether or not those accommodations were like used for a particular purpose. And it's just a way to weaponize the disabled body against other disabled bodies. Baudrillard. The Baudrillard affirmative would make a claim about how standardized testing is the symbol of intelligence that attempts to corrupt the potential of legitimate intelligence. One of the guiding principles that validates the existence of standardized testing is that it's supposed to be an objective metric that details either how intelligent someone is or how prepared they are for the content of the university, more the latter. However, this representation of an objective reality is only a mirror image of the institution's subjective desire to have students look at and navigate the world in a particular manner. We live in a postmodern capitalism era where the image of intelligence represented by a particular state controls whether or not someone has value. Even the way that students spend time learning mastery over the test, like buying books and sitting in front of it and constantly working, only becomes a means for internal validation. In other words, much like most models of schooling in the 21st century, students are taught that when they're studying, they're taking control of their own lives. But in reality, it's all being mapped out for them by those people. But what does reality matter? Wrong. Baudrillard doesn't function based on a brink. It's almost certain that we've lost control of reality and will never be able to regain it. However, complicity with the simulation stops people from being able to challenge the institutions responsible for the simulation. In other words, maintaining this same narrative is meant to push revolutionary thinkers as far away from the university and its products as possible, which means that discursive infiltration from the inside is the only ethical stance that one can take. There's one side note to consider when thinking about critical affirmatives. First, there are similarities and blends between what certain theories say that can be useful to research. For example, a lot of the biopower and cap literature come together when it comes to exploitation. The good versus bad narrative on the ableism math is eerily similar to the bootstrapping narrative on the model minority affirmative. It's important to notice these similarities and research past just a monolithic literature base because it's possible to build on and develop a greater understanding of what you're saying based on consistent research and its application to other areas. Now, when constructing a critical affirmative, there are a few questions you want to ask yourself with regards to what you actually do. Against another critique or topicality, the answer to the question, what do you do, will often help develop a coherent story. The first is, how does the plan or advocacy interact with the overarching structure that you discussed? So for example, if you read an anti-blackness affirmative about how standardized tests reinforce anti-black biases, how does illuminating standardized testing or like eliminating any of that stuff uh, stop the overarching structure that produced those biases? And why won't we just shift to another anti-black measure like GPAs? It's important to know that just because one thing is true doesn't automatically make the converse true. Second, you have to have a justification for your particular discussion. This is called the significance of your F. Why does it matter that you focus on disability instead of discussing the system writ large? And then like maybe reading a disability advantage under a whole res F? What's so special about what you're critiquing that it requires all 6 minutes of the 1AC to be entirely focused on it? Last, you have to know why it's important that you insert or introduce your affirmative to debate. If there isn't value in introducing your critique into debate, it will become awfully hard for you to explain an impact for most of these arguments because your solvency will likely rest on the value of this space. If you read like a narrative or performance affirmative, your solvency is probably going to be entirely based on what you do in that space. So it's important to answer that question. It's also another layer of offense that certain people won't be able to grasp if they're only reading traditional or like large P positions. If you have any questions about how to go about critical affirmatives, construction, or just an interest in a literature base and would like to talk, please don't hesitate to let me know over Slack, and I will be sure to get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much, and happy researching.